Have you ever felt a place remember you, even if you've never been there before? In Colorado, there are corners where the past isn't just history, it's a living, breathing entity. Come with me to 4 locations where time itself seems to bend. In Estes Park, the silent corridors of the Stanley Hotel hold echoes of countless footsteps. In Leadville, the cold dust of the Lantern Shaft mine whispers tales of those who descended and never returned. Travel to Durango, and you might see the eerie blue glow from Car 14, a phantom train car frozen in time. And in Glenwood Springs, the mineral size of the historic bathhouse seemed to carry the voices of a century. These aren't just haunted places. They are living ledgers, recording your presence, your breath, your choices. Listen closely, and you might just hear your own name called from the shadows. What happens if you answer? Join us as we explore the memories that scream without end. If you're intrigued by the mysteries hidden in plain sight, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more journeys into the unknown. I didn't go to Estes Park looking for ghosts. I went looking for a story. But the mountains there, they have a way of making you listen, of making you curious about the voices that aren't your own. Perched on the hillside watching over the town is the Stanley Hotel. It looks like a sentry, its dark eyes witnessing everything. I arrived in the late afternoon. The light was thin and golden on the lodge's balcony, and the air smelled like rain and old books. The receptionist gave me a key. It felt heavy, almost ceremonial, like I was being handed a shield instead of access to a room. I wasn't there to investigate some dramatic scream in the night. No. The story I was after was a collection of small, careful things. A piano playing in a silent hallway, a door closing on its own, a lobby clock that ticks to its own rhythm. They say room 217 is the heart of the hotel's memory. I had no idea how much a memory could hurt to hold. I checked in after dusk. The lights on the terrace flickered like tired eyes. The clerk was quiet, careful. The kind of person who speaks softly, afraid a rumor might shatter. He gave me the usual warnings, but without actually saying the words. Don't linger in the hall after 9. Don't answer the phone if it rings when you're alone. And if you hear the piano in the lobby, listen once, then forget you ever heard it. The voice of the mountains had always seemed trustworthy, until it wasn't. And I was starting to worry about what it might reveal. The room itself was spacious but old-fashioned. A heavy bed, a desk with a lamp that cast yellow halos on the faded wallpaper, and a window that looked out over a slope of pine trees, gathered like an audience. For the first hour, everything was so normal it was unsettling. My coffee went cold, the fridge hummed, the kettle gave up on boiling. Then, the small signs began, the little things that preferred to be felt, not spoken of. First, a single soft piano note drifted through the air. It was as if someone far away had pressed one key and just held it down. The sound didn't echo, it hovered, a silver thread of sound. I felt like I could almost reach out and pull it toward me. But there was no one there, no hands on any keys. The note seemed to shift whenever I moved, as if whatever was playing knew my thoughts before I did. Then came a scent from the hallway, vanilla, and something sharper, like cold metal. It didn't belong to the room. It felt like a message from behind a door I wasn't supposed to open. I stood in the doorway, listening to the floorboards sigh under a weight that wasn't there. The corridor lights wavered, and for a split second I saw a shadow, thin, tall, and gone as soon as the light steadied. It vanished at the very edge of my vision. Next, the ordinary things started to feel hostile. The bathroom faucet refused to stay warm. The mirror reflected a paler version of my own face. The chair behind me scraped backward, as if someone had just stood up from it. It sounds ridiculous now, but fear doesn't always announce itself with a roar. It whispers through your ribs and makes your breath feel heavy like you're trying to inhale underwater. I woke up in that dead hour of the night when sleep is supposed to tell you its secrets. The room was unnaturally still. The lamp was on, casting a stubborn pool of light. And from the hall, I felt a breath of air that wasn't mine, cool and deliberate, like someone walking past in a rustling coat. I was sure the door whispered, a soft, deliberate sound that didn't need words to carry its intent. I told myself I was imagining it, but a door turning by itself isn't imagination. It's a hinge's confession. When I lay back down, the bed shifted, as though a current moved beneath it. My ears filled with a sound I can only describe as a dozen fingers tracing the rim of a glass. It was the tremor of something old and patient, just waiting to be seen. I didn't see anything, not yet. And maybe that was the point. Some truths are kept by what you don't witness, not what you do. The night stretched on, and the mountains kept their silent watch. When dawn finally broke, I found a note on the desk, an almost invisible mark, a reminder that stories can want to keep you. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It simply warned that some rooms remember you long after you leave, and some memories are better left unvisited. That warning felt heavy as the pale light pressed through the blinds, turning the room into a quiet witness. The piano's single note persisted in the lobby, a distant, patient breath that never wavered. I stood at the window, listening to the wind negotiating with the pines as if the mountains themselves wanted to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. The note was still on the desk, more legible now in the morning light. The ink was just a shade lighter than the paper, but the words were clear. Remember to listen. It wasn't a question. It was a dare. And I had already stumbled into a conversation I never meant to join. Back in the room, the air felt heavier. A coldness crept along the walls like water seeping under a door. I went to the old guest ledger on the desk. The clerk had warned me that the entries in these pages never looked the same twice. The leather spine was cracked, the paper tea-stained, and it smelled of rain and old ink. I was looking for anything, any clue that could explain the whispering. Then I found it, an entry dated decades before I was born, scrawled in a shaky hand. It wasn't my writing, but it felt like a direct message. Listen for the heart of the house. It was a warning, a promise, maybe both, written by someone who understood that this place remembers every visitor. Just then, a shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I looked up. The hallway beyond my open door was thick with a cold breath, the kind that doesn't come from the weather, but from an old memory exhaled into the air. The light flickered, and for a fraction of a second I saw it. A figure, thin, tall, almost transparent, standing at the edge of the glow. It was watching me, with eyes that seemed to have learned patience from years of listening. The figure didn't move closer. Instead, the air between us grew dense, a barrier I could feel in my chest. Then the whisper came again. Not from the hall this time, but from the piano's long memory in the lobby. It wasn't quite a whisper, not quite a sigh. It was a murmur that slid along my spine and settled in the back of my skull. Listen. The command wasn't demanding. It was an invitation. It asked me to lean closer, to hear the difference between a creak of wood and a breath that belongs to someone else. When I did, a soft draft kissed the back of my neck. I could almost hear the rustle of drapes in another room, a movement that wasn't mine. I stood up to leave, but the desk lamp flickered once, as if a hand had hit a switch somewhere above me. The pages of the ledger rustled, and in the margin, where there had been blank space just a moment ago, a single line appeared. The ink bled slightly, as if the page itself had breathed onto the paper. It said, "You were invited." In the reflection on the glass desktop, I saw my own face, but it wasn't exactly my own. It wore a stranger's expression, someone who had learned to mimic fear with practiced calm. The image held for a moment, and I felt the entire room tilt, as if the building itself were turning to get a better look at me, deciding if I belonged in its memory. The lobby fell silent. The piano's thread grew faint, but the air still carried a weight I couldn't shake. I stepped toward the door, the note in my pocket now a hard lump. And then, the shadow in the hallway stepped just enough into the light for me to see its outline, a silhouette of someone who had waited a very long time for a listener. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that said, "Stay, listen, become part of the story you came to find." I didn't turn back. I walked out into a morning that felt too bright for the truth, leaving behind a room that would remember me long after I was gone. But as the door closed, I heard one faint, final piano note. It didn't fade. It seemed to cut into the air, the last echo from a story that had only just begun. If you ever go to Estes Park and you find yourself listening closely, maybe you'll hear it too. The heart of the house, speaking in a language only a visitor can learn, and only a memory can translate. I arrived in Leadville just after a blizzard had blanketed the town in a layer of white ash and a profound silence, as if the mountains themselves had pressed a finger to their lips. The locals, when they spoke of it at all, talked in careful whispers about a mine shaft they called Lantern. They knew the real name wasn't what mattered. The story went that the lanterns continued to burn there, holding a memory long after the men who lit them were gone. And one miner, he never left the tunnel, even after the collapse that should have buried him alive. They called it the Silent Shaft, a place where the walls seemed to listen as much as they received light. I came here with a notebook full of questions and a stubborn belief that a single, undeniable truth could be coaxed from the bone-white rock. Leadville's mines are old, older than anyone in town can comfortably admit, and their memories are not gentle. The Lantern Shaft sits on the hillside above the old Richer Street row, a yawning mouth of timber and stone. Its entrance is guarded by a stubborn iron gate with a hinge that creaks like a weary sigh, and a cold air that flows out, smelling of damp wool and iron ore. The caretaker, a man whose hands were scarred from years of tightening bolts and coaxing timbers, told me the shaft preferred visitors who listened more than they spoke. Two kinds of echoes live in Leadville, he said, leaning on a rusted pickaxe like it was a cane. One is the sound of men when they worked. The other is the memory of a man who refused to walk away. Some nights you hear a tapping there, as if a miner were striking a rhythm to keep time with his own heart. If you come to hear the second kind, you'll find it. The air near the shaft was so cold that my breath formed a quick ghost in front of my face. The lamp I carried carved a cone of light through the dust motes dancing in the air. The timbering of the tunnel pressed in on all sides, a lattice of weathered wood that looked like it could creak its way into a funeral if you stared long enough. In the caretaker's shack, old maps hung on the wall, showing the Lantern Shaft feeding into a corridor of smaller tunnels, a network that had long since become a web of rumor. The most persistent tale spoke of a miner named Eli who had vanished in a cave-in deep within the shaft, only to reappear in the daylight hours as a memory for the living, a man who kept working with a body that wouldn't die. That night I walked the hillside path to the shaft's mouth, my lantern bouncing against the ice in the air. The wind carried a dry rustle like cloth or dust, and a distant clang of metal echoed through the canyon, as if someone were sharpening a blade in secret. Inside the gate, the tunnel bent and then sloped downwards, seeming to lean toward the center of the earth. I followed the beam of my lamp down a corridor lined with old iron rails and the scent of drying ore. The air held a whisper of sweat and coal and something else, something like a breath left too long in a heavy coat. In the first chamber, I found signs that someone had been there recently, at least in memory. A rusty helmet perched on a wooden peg, a pair of boots that looked as if they had slept in the dust, and a ledger page tucked into a crack in the wall. The page bore a name, Eli, and a date from decades past, written with the careful hand of a man who hadn't expected anyone else to read it. The temperature dropped suddenly, and it felt as though the tunnel itself exhaled through the cracks. A soft tapping began somewhere beyond the candlelight, a rhythm that matched no known tool's beat but spoke to a clockwork inside the rock. I pressed closer to the wall and listened, hearing a mournful, almost polite tapping, like someone asking permission to intrude into a memory that wasn't mine. Then the tunnel seemed to tilt, or maybe I did. A draft pressed along my neck and a whisper brushed my ear. Not a word, but a pressure, a suggestion. The lamp's flame shook, throwing my own reflection back at me from the glassy surface of a mineral vein. In that mirrored moment, I felt a presence not separated from me by air and rock, a man who had learned to wait inside a cave until the world above forgot to listen. I stepped back, steadying myself against the cold wall. and I heard the tiniest sound, the soft, deliberate scrape of a metal tool deep in the distance, followed by a sound that was suspiciously like a breath. It wasn't mine. When I turned to leave, the mine gave a single, undeniable sensation, a memory with weight. The ground seemed to settle beneath me, as if the earth itself were trying to ground the figure I had become in this place. I didn't see Eli with my eyes, but I felt him in the space where fear and curiosity collide. The space where a miner's resolve survives a collapse, a space where a man can choose to stay. Tomorrow I will descend deeper into Lantern Shaft, to the place where the memory of a miner who refused to leave becomes something tangible you can touch, if only with your courage. The next morning, Leadville wore a pale frost like a patient bruise. I tightened the straps on my pack, checked the lamp, and met the caretaker's measured gaze, feeling as if he could see straight into the mine's memory. He spoke softly, more a whisper than a warning. Be ready to listen more than you speak. The tunnel answers in its own language, and every answer costs something you didn't plan to give. The gate groaned when I pressed my shoulder against it, a thin, almost polite sigh that traveled up the hillside. I descended with the same cautious pace, the lantern casting a cone of light that trembled against damp stone. The lantern shaft appeared different this time, not a tunnel so much as a living thing that inhaled and exhaled with the rock. The air was colder than before, tasting of iron dust and old rain. In the back of my mind lingered the memory of Eli, and the sense that the mine itself had rehearsed this moment for years, waiting for a listener willing to stay a while. Deep in the tunnel, the rails sang their stale song beneath my boots, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat I carried in my chest. The deeper I went, the stronger the memory seemed to press on the air, as if the rock itself remembered the weight of a man wearing a leather helmet and a face smeared with coal. I found Eli's signature in the dark the moment I rounded a bend, a fresh, chalky smear on the wall that looked newer than the dust around it. It wasn't a name so much as a memory etched in a language of marks, lines that traced a single stubborn idea. Stay. A sharper draft pushed through the corridor, and with it, the faint familiar tapping. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more taps, the rhythm of a man keeping time with his own breath. The sound seemed to drift toward me from somewhere beyond the wall, as if the rock had grown a listening ear and decided to speak back. I steadied the lamp's flame, listening not with my ears alone, but with a strange, growing awareness of the space between the picks, the steel rails, and the whisper that followed me. The deepest chamber opened before me like a throat with a single glistening diamond for a voice. Here the memory felt heavier, more intimate. On a wooden board nailed to the wall lay a ledger page, its ink brittle but legible. Eli, 1937, Lantern Shaft, entry logged. And beneath Eli's name, someone had added a line in a different hand. Listen with your whole body. The room's cold pressed against my chest, and I realized the space wasn't designed to reveal secrets so much as to compel a listener to become part of the secret. The memory of Eli rose from the air, not as a figure but as a presence, like a man standing just behind you, yet you cannot turn around to prove it. I felt the weight of his gaze, the quiet claim of a life lived in a tunnel where time runs slow enough to learn its tricks. You came to hear, a voice seemed to say, not loud, but certain. You came to stay. The tapping shifted, more deliberate now, guiding me toward a narrow seam in the rock that looked almost like a doorway only the brave could pass. When I touched the seam, the world narrowed to the whisper of stone and the drumbeat of my own pulse. A cold hand, no weight, just the sense of a hand, slid over my shoulder, guiding me forward as if Eli were finally teaching a pupil how to walk through memory without losing oneself. The air thickened and the lamp flickered, throwing my reflection on the damp wall like a second you stood beside me, wearing a miner's mask and a calm that felt older than Leadville itself. Then the passage opened into a void, not a space but a turning of time. I could see the moment of the cave-in as a distant, standing silhouette of Eli, his form not fading but widening, a memory growing weightier with every breath I took. The flame in my lamp burned lower, then died, and in the black I heard a soft, intimate sound, My own name, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine, a whisper more certain than fear. In that instant, I felt the mind's memory move inside me, not just around me. The thought struck with cold clarity. I wasn't descending to listen anymore. I was being invited to become part of the record. The air settled. The torch sputtered back to life, but only faintly. I stood there with Eli's presence inside me, the ledger's caution echoing in my chest. You are invited. And in that moment, the lantern shaft seemed to exhale, and a seam closed behind me, as if the mine itself had decided I belonged to it now. I whispered a goodbye to Leadville and to the man who never left, and I stepped into a silence that felt heavier than any rock had a right to be. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to the echo of my own breath returning from the stone. When I finally turned to make sense of the path back, I realized the gate did not look the same. The hinges spoke in a language I hadn't learned, and as I retraced my steps, I found a new mark on Eli's wall, a short line that wasn't there before, exactly where a name would live if memory decided to add a listener. The mine had chosen me. I was no longer the observer. I was part of Lantern Shaft's long memory. The thought of returning to the surface felt both possible and impossibly distant. The cave's whisper kept up behind me as I vanished into the dark, and I understood at last that some echoes are not echoes at all, but lives that refuse to end. Have you ever felt a place hold its breath waiting to tell you a story? That's what Durango, Colorado felt like when I arrived. A winter storm had just swept through, blanketing everything in a quiet, pristine white. The mountains stood like silent giants guarding a secret. Down by the old rail yard behind the station, there was this patient, rusting sound, a whisper from the past that you could almost feel in your chest if you just stood still and listened. The locals, when they spoke of it, lowered their voices. They'd talk about a particular passenger car tucked away in a shed, a relic among dozens of others. They called it Car 14. Rumor had it that after midnight, a soft, pale blue light would seep from its windows, and a voice would rise from the shadows. Not loud, just clear enough to make the hair on your arm stand up. They called it the night train, a ghost story, a legend, a whisper that memory itself could ride the rails. I wasn't a believer, not really, but I was curious. I had my notebook, a ton of questions, and this stubborn feeling that if I could just grasp one piece of this story, the rest would unfold. Getting access wasn't easy, but the Durango Historical Society, intrigued by my persistence, finally agreed to let me see Car 14 under supervision, of course. They didn't think I'd find a ghost. They just knew the car held a piece of the town's history they preferred to keep under wraps. The moment they unlocked the shed, this incredible smell hit me. Oil, old wood, and a faint hint of pine, all clinging to the air like a memory you couldn't just dust away. The car door groaned as I pushed it open, a sound like a long, weary sigh. It was as if it remembered every person who had ever stepped aboard and never returned. Inside, the space felt heavy, like a memory trying to straighten its back after leaning against a wall for a century. You could see the history in the weathered wood panels, feel it in the velvet seats that still held the faint imprint of hands from a bygone era. A tarnished brass bell hung from the ceiling, and on a small shelf a leather-bound ledger sat open, almost inviting me to read its secrets. The pages were filled with names of passengers, dates, destinations. The handwriting shifted from neat and tidy to hurried and rushed, the work of a conductor who'd seen too many journeys to trust memory alone. I ran my finger down the yellowed paper, and that's when I saw it. At the bottom of a page, scrawled in a different, fainter ink, were 5 simple words: listen with your own breath. It wasn't an order. It felt more like a challenge, a dare from the past, a memory that wanted to be heard, not just talked about. That night, I knew I had to go back. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a small, beat-up voice recorder I'd had for years, I returned to the silent rail yard. The river murmured softly in the distance, a constant, soothing sound against the heavy quiet. The car door gave that same familiar groan, and as I stepped inside, the air was even colder. thick with the scent of varnish and old leather. It felt like the car had absorbed every cold winter Durango had ever known. I walked the length of the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I traced the worn wood, touched the cool brass knobs, letting my fingers brush against the seams of the seats. It was like every inch of this car was saturated with the residue of countless journeys, countless goodbyes, countless secrets whispered in the dark. I stopped at the far end, where a row of seats faced a window looking out into the pitch-black night. The presence in car 14, whatever it was, wasn't aggressive. It was patient, like a conductor who knows every stop on the line by heart. It just waited. And then, as if it had read the question in my mind, a whisper rose from the empty seat right beside me. It was so clear, so precise. It felt like someone had leaned in close and spoken directly into my ear. The voice spoke a name. I can't repeat it here. Not because I'm afraid, but because in that moment, the name felt sacred, like a fragile piece of history that belonged only to the silence of that car. It was the name of someone who had bought a ticket long ago and simply never got off. The whisper then broke into a sound that wasn't quite a sob, more like a breath catching in the throat. The entire world seemed to shrink down to just that sound, and the sudden, impossible warmth of a memory trying to become real again. I held my recorder closer, my heart pounding, waiting. But there was no scream, no ghostly threat. It was just a quiet invitation, a profound reminder that the night train wasn't just steel and wheels. It was a corridor for lives that hadn't quite found their final destination. I felt something shift inside the car, and something shift inside me too. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was sharing the space. As I finally turned to leave, the car seemed to let out a long, slow exhale. The memory settled into a calm that felt almost peaceful. Stepping back out into the cold Durango air, the steady hum of my recorder in my hand, I felt a new weight in my steps. The night train had invited me to listen, and I had, now its story was sitting with me, a weight and a question that wouldn't let go. The memory didn't fade with the morning light. It got stronger, curling around my thoughts like smoke in a closed room. I found myself back in the shed the next day, drawn by an invisible string. The presence wasn't just a lingering echo anymore. It was a companion I couldn't shake. I felt it beside me, urging me to go back inside, to ask a question no one had dared to ask before. So I did. I reopened the car's ledger, and my blood ran cold. There was a new page, a page that hadn't been there before. It was an entry dated decades earlier, written in that same careful, clerk-like handwriting. It repeated the phrase, "Listen with your own breath." But underneath it, a new line had appeared. "Do not break the sound you hear. Learn it." The words clicked into place. This wasn't a one-way street. The memory would listen if I listened in return. It was a strange, almost crazy idea, but I had to try. I closed my eyes and focused on the faint, low hum that seemed to resonate from the car itself. I breathed in, matching the rhythm of the hum. I held it. Then I exhaled, mimicking the same pattern, and the car responded. The air shifted. A cold draft slid along the back of my neck. The memory was no longer passive, it was tactile. At the far end of the car, a shadow began to form, the silhouette of a passenger. A woman, her face pale and tired, a scarf wrapped around her neck as if shielding her from a phantom chill. She didn't move towards me. She just appeared, drawn into the space I now occupied. Her eyes met mine, and though she didn't speak, I felt her story. The car itself seemed to be translating the sound of her breath into a language I could feel in my bones. The voice from the ledger whispered again, more insistent this time. "Listen with your own breath, and you will learn the route this car took when memory forgot how to ride it." I felt the floorboards vibrate, and with it came a flash of a memory not my own, the final trip of car 14. A sudden violent jolt, the shriek of metal on metal, and then a profound silence. Not the silence of an ending, but of something left behind. In that final, crystal-clear moment, I was offered a choice. Stay and become a permanent listener on this train, or leave and let the story fade away? I didn't answer out loud. I just took a deep breath and felt the car's breath match mine. The page in the ledger vanished. The blue glow in the windows intensified, and from somewhere deep inside the rails, or maybe deep inside me, I heard the faint whistle of a train getting ready to depart. When I stepped to the threshold, the world tilted, not with fear, but with a strange sense of possibility. I closed the door to car 14 behind me for the last time and walked back into the world, but something had changed. I had been offered a choice I couldn't refuse. To ride again, to listen again, to become the memory that travels through the night. I arrived in Glenwood Springs just after a winter storm had stitched the town shut with white. The river ran thick with meltwater, a slow, patient pulse. Tucked away behind the modern pools sits the old Glenwood bathhouse. It's a stone shell that still smells of copper pipes, hot plaster, and minerals that cling to your skin the way old stories cling to a town. It's the kind of place people glance at, maybe shrug, and then cross the street, trying to avoid that line between memory and the present. But the locals, they swear this building remembers more than its tiles could ever teach. They say that at night, the steam isn't from the baths. It's from a memory that refuses to close its doors. It's a two-story ruin that never really died. As you step inside, the front hall greets you with a chipped marble fountain, once flowing, now dry but not lifeless. The ground floor is a maze of old steam rooms, a vaulted boiler room, and a long, narrow corridor where the tiles curve up like a wave about to break. The air is heavy with a mineral scent, iron, sulfur, and something faintly sweet. It's an aroma that stains your tongue and practically begs you to listen as you walk. I came here at dusk when the town's sound softened and the building began to do what it was built for: demand attention. The caretaker who unlocked the door for me was a man named Jace. He had the quiet of someone who'd learned to count echoes, with pale eyes that didn't blink much, as if he'd watched this place so long it started reflecting his own memories back at him. He told me the bathhouse hadn't had a proper guest in years, not in any way you could prove. But at night, he said, shadows like to stroll down the hallways, as if the walls themselves grew bored and wanted a listening ear. He warned me softly, "Don't speak too loud. Don't hurry and listen for what the stone wants to tell you." In the main pool room, the massive pool is empty, its tiles chipped and stained with the long memory of water that once roared here. A single door leads to the steam chamber, where the air hums with a residual heat, a pressure that presses against your chest, as if the room itself wants to remind you that breath is a currency here. The caretaker pointed out a bench along the south wall. On it was a plaque, its shine long gone, where a girl's name had been etched. He said that name wasn't there when he opened up that morning. But after a soft rain began to fall, it appeared Miriam. A simple, almost childlike inscription, a memory preserved with stubbornness. The town archivist had told me about a girl named Miriam who worked here as a cleaner in the early 1900s, a time when baths were rituals. Miriam wasn't famous in life, but it seems the bathhouse kept her breath. People say you can sometimes hear a soft, rhythmic tapping in the boiler room, like a heartbeat under a heavy coat. Others swear they've heard whispers, "Thank you" and a "Please, help me," drifting just at the edge of hearing, as if the room is practicing a language it learned from countless mouths over countless winters. That first night, I lingered near the boiler room, letting the heat soak into my skin. The echo of water rose in the pipes, a distant murmur that felt almost alive, the way a room can exhale when it wants to be heard. I didn't ask anything out loud, but the air returned a soft reply: "Be patient." A voice, not loud but clear, seemed to come from the old concrete walls themselves, telling me to listen. The lamp threw a halo on the damp tile, and the steam blurred the doorway into something dreamlike. I left with more questions than answers, feeling like I'd stepped into a story too old for ordinary words. The memory's trace remained. A sigh that wasn't wind, the sting of mineral air on my skin, as if the building itself had pressed a memory into me. The caretaker's final warning echoed in my thoughts: "Listen, and you'll hear what it remembers." As I turned away, the door no longer seemed like just wood and plaster. It felt like a boundary between the present and memory, glowing faintly as the lights flickered. The memory didn't fade with the night. It thickened, curling around my thoughts like smoke. I stood in the main hall, just listening to the bathhouse breathe through its old pipes, a sound that felt almost human in its patience. The presence pressed closer, not as a ghost, but as a quiet insistence that I stay longer, listen deeper. The steam room door creaked as I got near, its hinges recalling decades of footsteps. I inhaled that mineral scent, the perfume of memory. The room answered with a chorus of tiny sounds, the hiss of steam, a distant slam, a sigh traveling up the stone like a pulse. And then, the memory made a move. The plaque on the wall, the one with Miriam's name, began to glow with a faint, almost imperceptible light. The letters of her name shimmered, and beneath the old engraving a second line appeared, a new memory threaded into the old. Listen with your breath. Do not break the sound you hear. Learn it. It wasn't an instruction so much as an invitation. I stood very still. The whole building seemed to tilt just slightly, as if it were now listening to me. I followed a current of warmth toward the boiler room. The room had always held its breath, but tonight the breath was louder, a slow rhythm matching my own heartbeat. And in that room the memory spoke, not with words, but with sensation. A warmth crawled along my fingers, and with it came a feeling of Miriam's hands, deft and sure, wiping stains from the tiles. The memory was teaching me to listen not just with my ears, but with my whole body. I whispered the words from the plaque. I hear you, the bathhouse exhaled, a gust of steam rolling across the room like a visible sigh. The more I listened, the more the bathhouse revealed itself as a living map. I realized I wasn't just following a memory. The memory was following me, shaping my steps so I could carry a piece of its history back into the town. When I finally stepped back into the hall, the bathhouse did something almost tender. It let me leave with a name etched into my own memory. Miriam's name still shone on the plaque, but now I knew the real inscription was the one that urged me to listen, to carry the sound forward, to become a living part of Glenwood Springs' memory. I walked out into the night, the air tasting of mineral and rain, the bathhouse silent and listening behind me. The memory had chosen me to hear, to carry, to remember, and perhaps someday to tell someone else to listen, just as I did. The river flowed on, the town slept, and I felt a quiet certainty that memory doesn't end with a room or a plaque. It ends only when there's no one left to listen. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more hidden places with me, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means the world. Until next time, keep listening.